Eric?
Wonderful. Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us for day 2 of our 5-part webinar series, Solar Development in Ohio. Today, we're going to be talking about specifically kind of the solar development lease. Couple of housekeeping items, as Peggy just mentioned. If you see the notification on your screen, this session will be recorded. And so with that, certainly we'll be posting these and sharing them afterwards. We recognize that five sessions taking an hour and a half plus or minus out of your day is a lot with our schedules. So we'll post those in case you missed some. For questions and answers, kind of as we did if you attended yesterday, I will try to kind of filter and manage the Q&A box. If there's some issues that are more one-on-one, I'll try and address those in the chat box or in the Q&A box as we go. Some of these questions we might hold to the end if it's something that would benefit the group as a whole. So, and then finally, from time to time, we're going to try and use the chat box to share some resources. So if there's something that we need to share to the group, links to reports, stuff of that nature, we'll use the chat function for that. Next slide, Peggy.
I forgot that I was controlling, sorry.
So, again, a quick introduction for those that may not have attended yesterday. My name's Eric Romick. I'm a field specialist with Ohio State University, statewide extension specialist, focusing on energy education. So I get pulled into all kinds of different energy discussions. I think back to kind of, they talk about energy transitions. They come and go in decades, not years. And I can kind of think back to 2008, we were seeing a lot of natural gas additions in our generation portfolio. 2010, 12, a lot of wind interest. And then, of course, the horizontal hydraulic fracturing and oil and gas development in Eastern Ohio. So I get pulled into a lot of various energy discussions. Right now, certainly utility scale solar is the topic that dominates a lot of my time. But with that, I also focus quite a bit of my energy on farm research. So I have a number of farms throughout the state where both OSU farms and some private farms that we partner with, where we do some research for on-farm energy efficiency, essentially load shifting, peak demand reductions, stuff to that nature. So really happy to be here, and certainly happy to work with Peggy. So Peggy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Peggy Hall. I'm an attorney with OSU, where I direct the Agricultural and Resource Law Program, which covers a myriad of issues that those in our agricultural and rural communities deal with, and certainly solar energy is one of those. I did not expect when I became an attorney that I would someday be talking about solar leasing in Ohio, but that is where I've found myself spending a lot of time with both the leasing and the land use and regulatory issues that are coming with the solar development that we see here in Ohio. Eric, let's see who we have joining us today. I'm going to launch the poll. We just want to get an idea of who is joining us for the webinar today to see what your role is in this big world of solar development here in Ohio, and perhaps why you're here on the webinar today. So if you wouldn't mind answering that poll question, that will help inform us on that. Looks like we're almost to capacity with everyone responding. A few more to go here. Okay, let me publish this and you can see what we have. Can you see that there, everyone? Looks like primarily state and local government agency professionals, some local leaders, interested residents, some landowners, a few from Extension with us this morning, and as well as from the solar industry. Andy, I think you're the sole attorney with us this morning, and a few ag professionals and others. So good. Thank you for letting us know who's here. Eric? Let me get up here and I'll move you along. There we go.
Perfect. So, as we discussed, this is session 2 of our 5-part series. Session 1, we kind of talked about really an advanced introduction, kind of a deep dive into solar. We looked at some of the industry trends, technology trends, manufacturing, development, and then gave a little bit of overview on, what are kind of the good, bad, and otherwise as it relates to community interactions with this development. And then touched on a definition of large scale versus small scale, and trying to help kind of wrap our minds around what that means. So today we're going to do a deep dive into a discussion related to solar leasing. I can say personally, and again, this is very, very similar to kind of what, I guess, personally what I experienced with oil and gas. I can think like 2006. Peggy, I know you'll remember the name Mike Lloyd. Mike was a colleague,
Yes.
and he said, Eric, I don't know what's going on, but something's happening. There's a lot of leasing activity taking place, and it doesn't make sense. The same thing felt similar with solar, and except it was me calling Peggy going, Peggy, I'm getting calls in 2016 about leasing ground, and lots of it for solar. What's going on here? And of course, I don't know that any of us would have imagined it's evolved to where it is today, but certainly this is a very critical juncture in this development process, and certainly a lot of good information here today on the do's and don'ts of leasing. So one question real quickly, Peggy. We have a question that's asking, where will the recordings be and when will they be available? I'm assuming that we'll post those on the farm office website, which you pulled up here today.
Yes. They'll be
When
on this page that you're seeing here now.
and when we get to those, we'll I'm assuming email the group. But
Yes, the entire series will be there along with these other resources.
this farmoffice.osu.edu, and you can see a screenshot there where we have some of our past videos posted. We'll be posting this series on that page. So this link right here will get you right to it. And as we've discussed, we have a variety of resources related to utility scale energy development, and some videos that go with that. So some stuff related to land use conflicts kind of between renewable energy and agriculture. We have a lot of resources related to recent legislation, specifically with Senate Bill 52. What does that mean to local governments? What does that mean? We've kind of pulled out a little bit specifically with the decommissioning aspects of that legislation, and so those resources are available there. You also have I think next slide, Peggy. Yeah, I was going to say I was going to discuss this on the previous slide, but I thought we had called this out specifically. So the other resources that we do have available that specifically align with this webinar series is a farmland owner's guide to solar leasing, which was done with collaboration from the National Agricultural Law Center. It's a really good resource that kind of is a deep dive into looking at the leasing process, and again, some of the good, bad, and otherwise. And I'm sure that Peggy and Andy will reference this throughout the talk, but I'll just start it off. This guide's not intended as a replacement for sitting down and meeting with an attorney. This guide is to help inform you and spark that conversation with you and your attorney and your family members, so you better understand the process and things that you should be talking with. And then also we have the kind of the Cliff Notes version of that guide, which is the bulletin for farmland owners leasing checklist. So again, those resources are available at the farmoffice.osu.edu website. All right, so we warned everyone yesterday, and those of you that came back. So this is a slide we're going to revisit throughout this series, because I think it's important to help wrap our minds around what happens with this process. And there's too many times where Peggy and I've given these talks, and afterwards we'll get some questions, and I think to myself, there's still a disconnect. We're still missing it. We're still missing the target a little bit, because I think sometimes we kind of merge all of these different processes into one. And there's really three different and kind of distinct layers of the regulatory oversight in this process that we think are important. And number one is the interconnection process. So, first and foremost, you can't just connect an electrical generator to the grid. There's an approval process for that. And so that's kind of where this whole thing starts. As you can see there, depending on a number of factors, which we'll get in specifically tomorrow, that may be the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, could be PJM. But that is kind of that first step. The second step we think of is kind of a construction permit, to just simplify it. As you look at the Power Siting Board, it's often referred to as a certificate to construct, own, and operate an electrical generator. And so this essentially is the green light to go ahead and build it. As you can see there, that could be influenced by the Ohio Power Siting Board and following some recent legislation, which Peggy will get into in session 4 in great detail. That could be now through a county restricted zone or even local zoning in some instances. But and then I guess the final would be the approval for tax exemption, and we discussed that briefly yesterday. Qualified energy facility is so an approval as a qualified energy facility exempts those developers from the public tangible utility tax and sets in place that payment in lieu of taxes. So, I hesitate to use the word exemption, because a lot of times people will kind of look at that negatively. But as we looked at yesterday, there's still some significant tax revenue that comes from this program. So the thing we want you to remember, though, is we talk a lot these days about, kind of breaking down silos. These are somewhat, while they're interdependent at a certain level, they're kind of siloed processes where, it's a different set of individuals that are looking at that interconnection application. It's a different staff that's looking at your application to construct it, whether that's the state level or whether that's locally. And then again, your tax exemption, if that request comes through, that could be through the Ohio Department of Development. And then depending on the size, it may also need approval from county commissioners. So different steps, different processes. However, they're somewhat interconnected. You have to have your interconnection agreement at a certain, you have to be so far along that process before you can apply to the Ohio Power Siting Board. So it's important to kind of separate them, but also understand that they're connected. And so when we think about this, it's kind of staged as a timeline, and that's why we have these kind of tiered, but also it's why we kind of have this leasing piece hidden up in the corner. It really starts and stops with the leasing. And so one of the conditions for your interconnection application with PJM is to demonstrate site control. And I think this is important because I think it'll help local residents and local officials understand that if there's leasing activity currently taking place in your county today, this is going to be around for a while. I mean, this is likely going to be, a 4 to 6 year process before this could come to fruition. And I say could intentionally, because we see a lot of projects that enter this process but never actually complete it. We don't actually see a project that is operational at the end of the day. So just because it started doesn't mean it'll work all the way through. So with that, Peggy, why don't we move on and start to dive into the discussions of leasing.
Okay, thank you, Eric. And you certainly raised some relevant points there, and I'm sure Andy, who is joining us today, can speak to that long timeline that we sometimes get wrapped up in once we begin talking about the leasing situation. So we're going to hear from Andy this morning, who I'll be introducing in a moment. He will provide us with his view as an attorney who's been involved in solar leasing. And then after Andy leaves us, unfortunately, he'll have to leave shortly, we'll be going over some of those initial considerations to make before even really digging into the lease. I want to plant some ideas in your mind of the bigger picture and those initial considerations before getting to that leasing stage. If you do proceed to a leasing stage, then we want to talk about that solar lease and common lease terms that we see within solar leases. And we'll finish up with some thoughts on best practices for solar leasing. So let me go now to Andy Wecker, who is with us. Good morning, Andy, and thanks again for joining us.
Good
Andy
morning.
is Andy's an attorney with the law firm of Wright and Moore, and he's not been there a long time, but he's been an attorney for quite some time, practicing in the world of property law. And so he joined Wright and Moore because they were handling such a large caseload, I know, of landowners needing assistance with solar leases. And Ryan Conklin was handling that caseload. And now Andy has joined and has been able to step in and work with those landowners who are considering leasing. So he is an attorney here in Ohio. Andy, what else would you like to say about yourself before we get into some of the questions that I'd like to ask you?
I think I've lived in every single part of the state. And my wife, Kendra, and I, we have 5 children, ages 15 to 25. And, we, I live in a rural area. I love rural Ohio. And I think as I look at these deals, I can't tell you if I'm not pro solar or anti solar, but I am pro landowner, and it is good advice is hard to come by just because it's hard to get your hands on market information in this area.
Mm-hmm. And I hear that a lot from landowners. They want Eric and I to tell them those numbers and those, that will help them make a decision. And we agree. It's hard sometimes to understand what's going on there. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. I have a series of questions I want to ask Andy that I think will be informative to all of you listening so that you can get a bit more insight into the solar lease rather than my rather academic view. I unfortunately am not able to negotiate solar leases for landowners, so I wanted to bring Andy in and to provide that insight. So let's talk a little bit more about that role that you do play in solar leasing, Andy.
Yeah, I think Ryan Conklin and I have known each other for years, and it would often be the case if he had a question on a cell tower deal, he'd contact me. If I had a question on a solar deal, I'd contact him, except I always had an advantage because I had a guy who had worked in the tower business, but then had shifted to doing landowner rep only. And that industry insight is, when I talk to clients, there's legal decisions and there's business decisions. And these solar deals they're special types of negotiations, and it's a challenge for a general practitioner or an attorney, not necessarily because of the legal concepts, but because of those, what's market in the industry. And what I mean by that is, what's a fair rent? What's market on an option period? And what should the option payments be? And it's even harder to figure out these things. And Eric, I'd be curious what you've seen in the oil and gas business. Not all the solar leases I see have confidentiality clauses written into them, but many of them do. And I don't like that. I think it's anti-landowner. I try to push to get them removed, but sometimes clients don't always want to negotiate on that point because I'm trying to get as much information as possible so I at least have a sense of what's the going rate and what's fair to negotiate for a client, for example, on limitation of liability. What are people willing to agree to, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the biggest structure, is the land agents are all on the industry side. There's no land agents on the landowner side. And so I'm kind of stuck trying to answer both legal and business questions.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's so beneficial to those who are dealing with leasing and working with an attorney who's working in this area. You have that background and you do have a better sense
Mhm.
of most of us because of your your everyday work in this area.
Right.
You have a better sense of what's happening. And that is very difficult and challenging, I think, for landowners and for the rest of us who aren't actually actively negotiating the lease.
Right.
So, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm always looking for a land agent I can convert over to the landowner side. And then I'll have a cell tower guy and a solar guy doing landowner representation. I haven't
Well, I
done that
hope
yet.
that works out for you.
I do too.
So what kinds of changes? I know that Ryan, as I said, at Wright and Moore has been involved in solar leasing for as long as Eric and I have been involved in it, and now you've stepped into that role. What kind of changes have you seen over the years in solar leasing?
I think when Eric and I, or when Ryan and I look back at this era, the bulk of his work we'll probably see will have been with utility scale projects, which are 50 megawatts and up. And my rule of thumb is those are going to involve at least 300 acres. And my work will have been mainly with community scale projects that are under 50 megawatts. In fact, they may be more like let's say 25 to 50 acres as opposed to 300 acres. And that those utility scale projects tend to be pretty tightly regulated, or I don't even know if it's good to say that, because every time I do one of these deals, I think to the GM plant in Ontario that's basically mothballed. And I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I can remember when the sky started to clear because they shut the plants down. And I'm always thinking about that is, what's going to happen to these things at the end of their life cycle. And I think there's more of a regulatory presence on the decommissioning in the utility scale projects, but I don't want to say it's the Wild West, but I often feel I have no basis to underwrite the credit worthiness or the ability of these community developers, especially the ones that are probably just going to originate it and flip it and sell it off to someone else to actually build it. And fortunately, I've come up, there's one community developer that has some language that's better than what I've seen. I've been trying to incorporate that, but that's, I think, the long and the short of it is our sense of things is early bird got the worm. The utility scale projects that already have their interconnect agreements with PJM, which is the big multi-state grid operator, they're probably in pretty good shape and they're going to get built. And now it's a scramble for the utility scale projects that aren't that far into the process. Are they going to make it out of their option period to build? And then the community scale guys, they're different. They're in a different phase. Are they going to get the statutory and regulatory process they need in Ohio to essentially interconnect not into the PJM, but into the grids of the big investor-owned utilities in Ohio, like AEP, First Energy, Dayton Power and Light.
So Andy, when you use that term community scale, because I know there has been confusion across Ohio on that, what do you mean by that term, community scale?
When I say community scale, and it doesn't mean it's going into your community. That's not what this means. The electricity goes where the power purchase agreement says it's going to go, essentially. And when I say community scale, it's not a footprint that's hundreds of acres. It's a footprint of, as I said, it could be up to 160 acres, but probably it's going to be more like 25 or 50 acres, because what they're connecting into is three-phase distribution, and they just can't put as much power into that. And so it's just a smaller project that is not as thoroughly regulated yeah, community scale is a euphemism for saying,
Mhm.
it's a shorthand way for saying we're not regulated by the Higher Power Siting Board. That's what
Okay.
that is.
Okay. Good. Good to clarify that. And I know that Eric and I have been seeing movement, especially up in Northeast Ohio, with those smaller projects. We've been getting more and more questions suggesting that there is a lot of
Yeah.
activity coming there, which is not where we've seen as
Yeah.
many utility scale
I think
projects.
if you're in an unzoned township that is serviced by an investor-owned utility, you're probably on a map someplace that some land agent down in Texas is looking at.
Oh, goodness.
And
Well,
can
go
I
ahead,
jump in
Eric.
real quick, Peggy?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is really interesting discussion, Andy. Tomorrow we're going to focus a lot on the difference between an interconnection process with the PUCO and looking at their three different phases, I guess you'd say, for interconnection approval compared to PJM. And so with PJM, we have kind of a crystal ball where we can see what activity is kind of further up the development pipeline. I've struggled to wrap my arms around what that looks like on, I guess, what you would say these community scale projects going on the distribution side. So, but if I understand you correctly, you're saying that's where a lot of the activity that you're seeing is at?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, and I'm certainly seeing utility scale projects, but I get the sense from talking to Ryan, my mix of that is not nearly as much as his mix.
Mm-hmm.
And, like for example, the one of the utility scale projects I had this year, I was helping a client to coach their landlord out of actually signing up for a utility scale deal. Because they kind of needed that 600 acres, there's 700 acres to make their
Exactly.
operation work. And what we talked about is, that county is kind of that in that I-71 growth corridor. Are you really sure you want to tie up your project for 7 years on that, Mr. Landowner? Especially with what my client is able to pay in rents, because my client's a pretty good farmer. And at the end of the day, the landowner did not tie up the acreage because we schooled them a little bit on our perception of the utility scale environment in this Ohio in terms of its maturity, I think might be how I would put Eric.
Mm-hmm.
That was enough to save the day. Now we'll have another argument at some point, or a discussion perhaps, if there's some other development opportunity that comes along. But I think, one thing I'd be curious to hear you say, like, I don't know if when I think of three-phase electric, if somebody wants to see if they're on the list, it's not just a pole, but it's a pole at the top with a T, and then there's 3 wires at the top. That's essentially how to tell if you got three-phase electric. And if you do, then the next question is, are you an electric co-op or a investor owned? And then finally, do you know where your substation is? And if you know where your substation is, you may have a developer contacting you at some point. That's how
Yeah.
slight the infrastructure requirements are for the community scale projects.
And so that's why we're now seeing this emergence and interest in going that route.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
I
So,
anecdotally, one thing that shocked me is I have an acquaintance in North Carolina. His wife works for a national title insurance underwriter, and her full-time responsibility is servicing community scale developers up and down the Appalachian Ridge. And that's, Ryan has told me, well, North Carolina tends to be more of a community scale than a utility scale market.
oh,
That's
okay.
that's how they're bringing their megawatts online.
Mm-hmm. And I do think, in my experience, I'm sure Eric would echo this, that we do see a little less conflict with those smaller footprints, smaller projects, than we see with the large, hundreds or even thousands of acre type projects. So it certainly changes the dynamics a bit. in that overall question of what's happening within the community. So as you work with clients on solar leasing, what is that general advice then that you kind of begin with as you start out that process of helping them with solar leasing?
If it's a utility scale project, I will check to see if we've done work in that project before. And at that point, we'll probably we'll just check the lease to see if it's consistent with terms we've negotiated previously. And it's I don't want to say, for lack of a better term, it's more of an off the rack situation that there's already a precedent established, and there's certain perimeters where um, this is the deal. And it's almost like Henry Ford used to say, I'll give you a car any color you want as long as it's black. And the one thing I would say is I did have one client in a utility scale deal where we had a most favored nations clause, and that was great. I try to use that wherever I can get it. Sometimes they don't like it. And what that means is whatever price you sign at, if they cut a deal for something on more favorable terms, of course, there's audit questions in this, how you find out if that ever happened, then you get bumped up to whatever those terms are. It's kind of like when you're at a 4-H auction and somebody says, oh, I'm raising everybody's lamb up $100.
Exactly.
And that takes a little bit of the sting out of the confidentiality provisions that always irk me when I see these. On, the community scale deals, that's where it's a little more freewheeling. And if you are in a situation, and I've had clients like this, where they're situated such that you're getting offers from multiple developers. Well, at that point, you've got an opportunity to get a lot more information. I still think the industry cooperates or even colludes more than I would like. They all know what they can pay, but if you can get 2 or 3 of them betting against each other, that can be an opportunity to learn. And that the big thing on community scale compared to utility scale deals, so I try to focus a lot more on the decommissioning language, removing it at the end of the life cycle, and then anything we can do to underwrite on the quality of the developer and what the business model is and who their capital partners are. And references, we'd like to get references. And what I mean by references is landowner references where you've already built.
Good. And I can't tell you, Andy, how many landowners I've talked to who've said, well, I've been approached with a lease, and I'll ask, well, what kind of project is it? And they don't know.
Right.
They don't know what's in the works. And that's so important to have that understanding of what that developer plans to do.
I mean,
what kind of project is it?
Imagine, you're going to the bank and you want to borrow, I don't know, pick a number, 300,000, 400,000, 500,000. Well, what kind of questions do you think the bank would want to ask of you, and what do you need to document? You probably can't get the kind of information the bank has, but at least be thinking of those questions and try to get as much information, or hiring somebody, because you're tying your property up, you're keeping it off the market, and maybe that's fine because you'll continue to farm it, but you're still, who's to say, if you're open to doing a solar deal, maybe a better developer is going to come along who will work with you more, who will be more responsive.
Timing is critical, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit more about the specific legal issues that you do encounter beyond those that you've already noted. Is there something you'd like to make landowners aware of? We don't want you to give away all of your representation as an attorney, but just generally, what are some of those legal issues that you frequently encounter that you can negotiate for landowners?
I think the things that come up to me is these developers go to great lengths to create legal structure to protect themselves from liability for them and their capital partners. And, if I'm representing a landowner that has 1,000 acres and the lease is going to tie up maybe 150 acres, well, I want to see what I can do to limit the language. So to the extent there's any dispute, it's only on that 150 acres. It's not as to the rest of the client's balance sheet. And sometimes I can do that with language. It's also good, clients often, people who've never had their land in LLCs before, they start to think, oh, it would be good to have this in an LLC. That I have the land, I don't want my house at risk. I don't want the rest of my operation at risk. And, and it's good to take a look at insurance and indemnification language and along with the limitations of liability. And I've got a good mutual limitation liability clause that I actually stole from a developer's lease that so far I've had good luck in getting that accepted. The other thing that I think people aren't used to day to day, but comes into focus with these lease deals is, at a minimum, you're looking at a lease term that's going to be 25 years with who knows how many 5-year options tacked on after that. And it gets people often thinking about estate planning in ways that they hadn't thought before because, I'm 56 and my parents both made it into their 90s, but if I sign one of these leases today on a property, it could well be a lease that I won't be dealing with, but my kids are dealing with at the end of it. And that's even more true if you're in your 70s, is some of our clients have been. And so, and then, I've mentioned decommissioning language before. That's a big thing to keep in mind. That's at the end of the deal, but at the start of the deal, you want to be thinking about, do you have a map of your drainage system? Get it to them, and better still, have that incorporated in the lease that I can guarantee you there's going to be damage done to that drainage system, but can we limit that damage to laterals and protect the mains? And can we agree on how we're going to go about getting that repaired? And then crop damage. Crop damage comes up not just at the construction if they decide to build, but it can also come into play. There's a lot of due diligence that goes into these sites, and they'll be sending surveyors out. They'll be sending archaeologists out. They might be sending environmental consultants out. And so crop damage is another thing to think about, and try to put in some good communication at the start and on an ongoing basis so people are cooperating with each other.
Good. This is all good information and advice. I certainly appreciate you highlighting that. I know that's a lot of what you do for landowners, and we don't want to give away your legal advice for free, but it's definitely helpful to get folks thinking.
I think, to be asking the right questions, like, I've had people negotiate on vegetative screening. I've had people negotiate on fencing. That can be hard to do on a utility scale project because they won't commit to it. But the community guys, well, they may need 6 or 7 or 8 foot tall fencing because they want to keep the deer out, but they might be willing to do agricultural fencing instead of chain link. And that can be a big deal to people. They don't want to look at chain link. It looks too,
right.
Too industrial.
I've reviewed, and you can see that, when you're in that larger utility scale world, in the application that's submitted to the Power Siting Board, they do have to submit those plans. And you'll see people object to that we don't want to look at chain link. We want vegetation, and that does seem to be a common concern that we see in those applications.
The utility guys will be more flexible and creative, or I beg your pardon, the community scale people will be more flexible and creative on that.
Yeah, just a matter of that scale of that project. I'm certain makes a difference. There are a couple of questions that our attendees have asked, so I'm going to see if you want to take a shot at answering some of those. The
Sure.
first is, have you seen any leases with a right of first refusal for the land involved? And would that put, if that landowner who signed that option passes away, does that mean that land is now at risk of the solar developer being able to purchase it?
One of the things I will always look at, and it's something I first noticed in my cell tower leases, they will try to put transfer restrictions in, and I try to get those pinned down as much as I can. And, you know, I think what they're often worried about is they don't want it to be sold to a competitor or somebody in their industry who is going to retrade them at the end of the term. They like to deal with the amateurs, frankly, which means the local landowners. And so I try to tell them, if it's for estate planning purposes, or if it's to sell the whole thing, all my acreage, to no, you don't have a right of first refusal. Or if I'm going to give you a right of first refusal, we're going to pin that down as tight as possible and try to make it 10 to 30 days or something like that. But I would always be watching for transfer restrictions, because and I'm just like, I'm always watching for anything that restricts the ability to mortgage the property, because this should be a fairly high income stream, and you want to be able to collateralize that. And, maybe you can take the rental income off of this and borrow some money to go buy some more land someplace else. So anything that restricts an owner's right to transfer or to mortgage, I push back on. And you can usually come up with something that will address both sides' concerns.
Okay. So when you work with different solar developers and their leases, do you see a lot of variation from developer to developer and lease to lease?
I think they all need work, but I think we're far enough along in the process that they know that they always try to get the advantage. But in Peggy, you and I have talked before about the book, When Night Comes to the Cumberlands. I'd urge anybody doing one of these deals to read that book, just to get them in the right frame of mind for what you're up against. But the actual document, I think we live in a day and age where there's enough information out for people who want to find it, that they know they can't open with a one-sided document if indeed they are competing for land, and they need to have something that's somewhat approximately to being fair if they have any prospects of getting the land under option. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's good to know.
And that falls in. I don't trust anybody past my understanding of their self-interest, and it is in the self-interest of the developers not to have a document that's horribly one-sided, because that will ice the deal and put a lot of friction in the getting it signed. But they're not doing that because they're nice guys or great Americans.
Okay, a couple other ones here that get to some financing issues. Is it common for a developer to want to have the ability to finance their loans against that leased property? Does that put the landowner at risk? I have seen those provisions in leases.
That's a routine part of all of these, is their capital stack. They've got some pretty good equity partners, but they're all going to be borrowing money. They're all leveraging. And yes, they will ask to, they're not leveraging. The landowner who owns the property fee simple, that's not what the developers are asking to leverage. They're asking to leverage the leasehold if they decide to exercise the option. And that might be splitting hairs for most people. But structurally, that's the way these deals are. And I will try to do as much, like I'll try to negotiate on real estate taxes that they get a separate tax parcel identification number from the county auditor, so the tax bill goes to the developer. Because if the tax biller, if the developer can separately mortgage the leasehold, I want I want them to get the tax bill so my client doesn't have to track them down for taxes. So that's something where you do need a lawyer, because most of us aren't used to thinking of, the bundle of sticks that the rest of us learn as 1Ls in law school. But that can help you understand and explain that part of the lease, and also maybe get something worked out on real estate taxes to, the tax bill's going to the right person. That I can't imagine being a landowner, open up the mail for the first tax bill related to, 50 or a 25 megawatt facility going live. But
You don't want to see that number.
right. But no, you're right on the financing part. That's something I'm used to seeing from cell tower deals as well, that they are separately financeable.
Good. What about mechanics liens on the infrastructure that they're putting onto the property? Can that be placed against the landowner if there's outstanding debt for that project?
It shouldn't affect the land. A mechanics lien is a non-consensual lien that you get from statute based on whatever improvements you make to the property, that enables the holder of that lien to go to a sheriff's sale and have the property interest sold. So what would transfer as a matter in that sheriff's deed wouldn't be the deed of landowner John Smith. It would be the leasehold interest of solar developer. And as I explain that, I can imagine if I wasn't a legal practitioner, that would all give me a lot of heartburn. That feels like splitting hairs. But that's something you need to think about as a landowner. If you're not comfortable with that setup, then maybe one of these deals is not for you. But it can't be used to knock you out, but it complicates things.
Well, Andy, I know you've run over and you have to get to a meeting, so I appreciate your time and your insight on this. I think the only question remaining is just, do you want to provide any insight on what those numbers are out there, those rental amounts? I'm going to leave that to you to say yes or no, what you're seeing.
What I would tell you, just ballpark wise, a utility scale deal, that's a lower 4-figure amount, and what I mean by that is $1,000 is 4 figures. But they're prepared to tie up a bunch of land and pay rents at that amount of $1,000 an acre. And then the community scale deals are probably might be 1,500 pushing into the 2,000s. So I'm never critical of rents. What always gives me heartburn is these escalators that they use that are somewhere between typically 1% to 2%. And we'll push them if we've got competing offers. But given this inflationary environment we are in, I hate those escalator amounts, especially when they're locking them in for 30 years.
So you'd like to see those a little higher.
Yeah, and I have not found a chink in that armor yet.
Okay.
I remember the good old days with cell towers before we went in this low inflationary period. You'd get CPI or inflation, no problem, but I haven't seen that. And I've talked with my friends that work in commercial real estate and on the landowner side, and they see similar. They're not real happy with their escalators, but they're only stitched into 5 to 10 year leases, so they don't have as much to scream about as I do.
Well, I really appreciate your time. And I think you have illustrated very well how important and useful It is for landowners to work with an attorney who's knowledgeable in this area. You've certainly demonstrated that. So, Andy, thanks for your time.
Welcome.
And as a member of the Ohio State University, I can't recommend only one attorney, but I can provide those of you who are interested with a list of attorneys, and Andy's name would be on that list
Thank you.
of attorneys who are negotiating solar leases for landowners. Though I doubt you need more business, Andy, from what I hear. There's
We're
a
fortunate
line.
here. We're fortunate, very thankful. We get to work with a lot of good people in Ohio.
Well, and you do good work. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I'll let you get on to the rest of your day.
Well, thank you, and I'm enthusiastic that you and Eric both. It's my pleasure.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Take care.
Yep.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Eric. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Well, I think now that Andy's spoken, I'm not sure I need to say much, Eric, but I think he covered quite a bit of territory in that amount of time, and I hope you all found that useful. But let's turn now and tie together much of what we were hearing in Andy's comments and think about those initial considerations for solar leasing if you are a landowner who's considering this. And as Andy said, Eric and I, being with Ohio State University, we don't take sides on this issue. We're not advocating one way or another. Our goal is to inform all of you who are involved in solar leasing and solar development across Ohio, and to try to provide you good information and resources as you work through that issue. So one thing that I do encourage, certainly as an agricultural attorney, is to look at this from a step back and look at the big picture. And Andy was encouraging that as well. So there are some initial considerations that I think landowners need to tend to before ever getting into the nitty-gritty terms of a solar lease, before making that decision whether you want to proceed with solar leasing. And the first, I think Andy just illustrated the importance of having good advisors who join you as you make this decision and decide whether to move forward and then how you move forward. So not just an attorney who understands solar leases. You might need to bring in your farm business attorney if that attorney isn't dealing in that world, or your estate planning or transition planning attorney. All of those legal advisors that understand you, your estate, your family, your situation, and that understand solar development and the leasing process can be really helpful. You also may need to confer with an accountant, with your financial planner. Revenue streams certainly can get tricky. We need to tend to those. Your lenders, I have talked with lenders who are a bit nervous about their clients deciding to move forward on a solar lease. So you need to talk to your lender. There may be a need to subordinate their interests in the land. Your insurance agent, all your farm management professionals that you rely upon, thinking about the future of that land. There's a whole team of advisors, I think, that can be helpful in making the decision and moving forward. And Andy already highlighted the importance of due diligence, knowing who your developer is, or the different developers, and comparing them, and what is the project that they're doing. So doing homework, asking questions, finding out information on what exactly is the landscape that you're dealing with, that company behind that offer and their plans for your land. And new here in Ohio now is the issue of county and township authority. When we first began back in 2016 talking about solar leasing, there was very little local authority over large scale solar energy development or smaller scale development. Now we have both. We have the ability for the county to set restricted areas or to reject a larger over 50 megawatt project altogether. We also have the ability of our county and township zoning authority to step in and have regulations affecting solar development. Those are new developments, and so that's something to look into. Where does my county and township stand on this issue? Because you may not be able to do what the developer wants to do. And we haven't talked enough, I think, yet, but we will get into this more, how long this commitment is. I think Andy touched on the fact that you could be looking at the next generation that is dealing with this project after you're gone, if you're the one negotiating it. Understand when you put all those different terms together, and we'll discuss those here in a moment, what is the length of this commitment? And am I and my family prepared to make that long of a commitment to the land? And I think tied to the county and township issue that I just discussed is this certainly growing issue of neighbor and community relations. We have seen a lot of divisiveness across the state on the issue of solar development, and the sides line up. And there are those who support it and those who don't. And so, oops, I see I have a mistake there on my slide. I apologize for that. So who's in support? How will it affect your neighbors? What kinds of reactions? I've talked to farmers who have said, I wish I had never entered into this lease because I am now kind of an outcast in my community. If that's something that might concern you, you need to look into that and know what those difficulties and conflicts are that you might be addressing with your neighbors and within your community. And then we have changes to the farm and the operation. We're looking at those physical impacts to your operation, whether you're taking all or part of the land out of that operation, and changes to that land base. What will that revenue generation do to your operation? I've seen some use that new source of revenue to build a new agricultural enterprise into the farm, or that's their plan. If they do indeed have that revenue, they'll use that to diversify the farm or expand the farm or in other ways. And what is the borrowing capacity? How are you going to be affected if you place that restriction on the land? We often leverage our assets in agriculture in order to do our operating loans or buy more land. How are you affecting your borrowing capacity by tying up that land? And what other land uses, as Andy mentioned, are you foreclosing and preventing yourself from pursuing in the future? And then finally, we have family matters. There are a lot of family conflicts going on out there. And so be aware that there can be issues from one generation to the next on this. There can be diversity in whether that entire family wants to proceed with a lease or not. So talking with the family may be useful because, as we said, it is likely to affect that next generation, and the person making the decision now could be creating issues that those future generations will deal with. So bringing in the family, trying to seek consensus. But on the other hand, we know that this revenue can create a boost to those of you who are dealing with retirement and long-term healthcare needs. This can be something that brings some security to those issues. So balancing those different needs within your family is certainly something that needs to be addressed before you make that decision. And I said that I messed up on the slide up here at the top. I have this language. I think I moved things around and left something out. What I'm referring to there, whoops, let me go back to that. Leases, mortgages, government programs, mineral rights, easements, joint owners. What I'm referring to there is what other legal interests are on the land, and what do you need to do to tend to those if you want to proceed with leasing. That's an initial consideration that you need to make. You may have government program penalties. You may have a lender who's not willing to subordinate. You may have easements, whether they're other utility easements, drainage easements. Some of our lands have agricultural easements that protect that land and prevent it from being taken out of agricultural use. You need to look at all of those other legal interests that come into play and how they could be impacted and whether you can adequately deal with those in order to proceed with a lease. So I apologize for my mistake there on the slide. So those are some of those initial considerations, I think, that you would be wise to work through as a landowner. I know many of you on the webinar today are not in that position, but you're working in and around landowners who are in the process of making that decision or entering into a lease. So I hope that having that landscape in place for all of you can be helpful as you deal with the issue of solar leasing. Okay. And Eric, I know I'm talking really quickly. I'm trying to make sure we finish on time, but please do interject if you see any questions I need to answer. If you do have a question, put that in the Q&A box. We've disabled the chat box now for those kinds of questions so that we can answer them within the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to those. So once the decision is made and you want to proceed with a solar lease, and again, I'm speaking from the role of a landowner, understanding the solar lease and the common lease terms is going to be challenging. As we mentioned, through Andy's experience, there's a lot of variation out there. So I want to review a few principles, and I think that Andy touched on many of these already. So no two leases are alike. We know that even as we go from one developer in one leasing situation to another leasing situation, they may not use with you the lease that they negotiated with another landowner, and that's the importance of the clause that Andy was speaking of. If they negotiate a better deal, then you want to be able to assume those higher deals. But no two leases are alike generally. I think you need to get that in mind. The structure of that lease, you can look at one and look at another. They will look completely different. And the terms that are within them can vary tremendously. And that will depend upon that developer and the type of project. Is this going to be a large utility scale project? Is it going to be a smaller scale project? Leases will vary according to even what the project that's envisioned will be. So be aware of that no two leases are alike. And we mentioned the importance of negotiation. You don't have to take that model lease that's handed to you. Sometimes it might appear that way. Sometimes you might have very little room for negotiation, but working with an attorney who's knowledgeable in this area can help you try to negotiate that lease to address your specific needs on your land and your specific situation. And I firmly believe that if you get someone like Andy involved, you're going to have the possibility of negotiating terms within that lease. And be aware, even though we now have some new regulations and laws in place in Ohio, and Andy mentioned the new decommissioning provisions that apply to larger projects, we can't replace regulatory oversight with the terms that should be in a lease. You need to have both. We can benefit as landowners from the regulatory provisions, the new laws that are now in place, but laws and agencies change over time. Your lease does not. You need that written document that would incorporate those provisions that you think are beneficial in those regulations. Try to incorporate as many of those as you can and make sure that you have the enforcement mechanism, your lease, to step in if those laws and regulations and agencies change over time. As we said, it could be 30 years down the road. So we want that lease to be a strong enforcement mechanism too. So let's take a look at what a lease typically looks like. As I said, they're not all the same, but generally we do see different parts assembled, often in different ways and with different terms even given to them. But the lease does in many ways follow the life cycle of the solar project itself. And so once you sign something and it becomes effective, we're usually in what we call an option phase, or sometimes the language will be a development phase or a pre-construction phase, or sometimes there are two phases within that first block that I'm showing you there, the development, pre-construction, option phase. But it's important to know that what's happening in that phase is that we're just in the holding pattern until a decision is made that the project will indeed come into being and will proceed then with construction. And that's when we enter the construction phase of the lease. And once construction is complete and we begin generating power, we're now in the solar operations phase. And then there might be a renewal of that solar operations phase for 1 or 2 more terms. And then when we end that operations phase, we enter into the cleanup phase of the lease. And then finally, the end of the project. And as we work through these different phases, it's typical that the payment that a landowner would receive will increase, and this will be the highest rental amount, of course, here when the project is actually generating energy. So we might have a signing bonus and then a lower payment initially until the facility is constructed and operating. Then we have the highest payment, and then once we start to end and clean up, we're going to go down to a lower payment there, and then finally no payment at all, of course, once that project has ended and been removed. So that's somewhat typical. You just won't see it as nice and neat as I've laid it there if you look at a lease, but you will likely find those different phases there somewhere within your lease. So I want to look at those different periods and payment terms. We're going to look at some actual lease terms now. We'll look at easement provisions that are often in leases, property management and use issues that I want to address, taxes, and then that end, the decommissioning and cleanup, as well as some of the general legal clauses that Andy has already provided a good foundation for. But what I'm going to show you here is not an exhaustive list of everything that you might see or might need within a solar lease. I don't have the time to go through that. And as we know, your situation could vary and the project could vary. So the list will not be the same for everyone. But I will provide you, as we work through some of these, with actual terms that we have found. We have assembled leases here that have not been subject to confidentiality clauses that we have been able to take a look at. And so I'll show you illustrations of different terms that will relate to some of these terms that I'm going to discuss with you. So these are from actual leases that we've been able to obtain here at OSU. So first, let's take a closer look at those lease periods and the payments. And you can see here one big fat paragraph that outlines the different lease periods. Sometimes it's a little bit more orderly than that, as you'll see in another example that I have. But this paragraph is laying out those different periods or phases of the lease. And you can see that there's a due diligence period, a construction period, a operations term, and then finally there's an extension period. That would be that renewal that I talked about. And so they've laid that all out and given you an idea of how long each of those periods would be, what they are, how long they might be. And then typically they will tie the different rental payments to those amounts. And I'll show you that in a moment. So when we start with that first period, the option phase or the due diligence phase, as I just showed you in that example, what happens there is the landowner has given that developer the right to develop if the developer proceeds with exercising that option. The developer can back out and never exercise that option, but the landowner cannot. Once you enter into that, sign that, some money is paid, you are bound to that as the landowner, and you are stuck to waiting for that phase to end. Now, this could be a separate document that's signed. Sometimes it looks a bit like a letter, which can be a little bit misleading in letting the landowner know that they're actually signing a legal document that binds them. Sometimes it's contained and bundled in with the rest of the lease. So signing that separate option, though, we have found many provisions where they've pulled it out and separated it, but included language that says, by signing this option, you will also agree that you will accept the lease that we will give you in the future if you exercise the option. So they might give you an idea of what the material or the most important terms of that lease might be, but they're not going to give you all the details of that lease. So that separate option can be a little bit worrisome. And the preference would be to have an option that's contained with the full lease that would go into effect if they exercise that option. And so you can see here an example from an option that says if we choose to exercise this option, we'll notify you in writing, and that's common, and we will then deliver the lease that will, incorporate all the terms and conditions that you would be bound to. And it does, in this example, give you some of those material terms, but it doesn't give you the full lease. So a little bit of a risk there. If you're looking at that kind of situation, the preference would be to have that entire lease when you sign the option. So the option phase, when Eric and I first began working in solar leasing, we saw much shorter option periods, around 2 or 3 years, some up to 5 years, but now we're seeing longer option periods, especially for those larger projects. And that's because it is taking longer to get those projects to a point where they know whether they can proceed with exercising the option and will be constructing a project. So some of them now are in the 7-year range, those option periods. But what we need to know is during that period, whether it's 2 years or 7 years, what are your rights as a landowner to use that land while it's basically in this holding pattern? Can you continue using the land for agricultural production? What kinds of obligations do you have? I've seen some where the developer wants the landowner to take certain actions every year during that phase in case they do need to begin with construction. So be aware of those rights and obligations. And usually, as I mentioned, there's a requirement for the developer to give you a written notice if they do decide to exercise the option and are planning to proceed with constructing that project. So here's an example from a lease of some of the language you might see. You can see this one is a 5-year option period, and the developer has the right to terminate it at any time. There is some initial consideration, or what we typically call a signing bonus, that is paid for signing this option, and that would be paid within 15 days. And the payments, I put X in there because in the lease we had, they were blank. But the option payments are going to typically be on a per acre per year rental amount that you would receive annually. So we leave the option phase, they exercise the option, they are telling you, yes, we are going to proceed with this project. This now puts us into what we might call the development or construction phase, different language and different leases. But typically now the rental amount will go up some because they're actually going to possess the land and start doing things on the land. And you can see here an example from a lease that during this construction period, we're going to pay a certain rent that's tied to the land now because we have exercised the option, and that rent will begin once construction begins and will end once operations begin. And I'll show you in a moment something that focuses more on those different payments in those different terms. So something to be aware of, though, there is that rental payment for the land during the construction phase, but we also somewhere in the lease want to address the crop loss payments, so that if you had a crop in the ground when they exercise the option and now they want to come on and begin constructing before you're able to harvest that crop, we need to address compensation for that crop that you're now going to lose because of the construction. And we need to know exactly how we're going to determine the value of that crop that remains in the ground. So you can see here a provision that's pretty general, just saying we're going to pay you on a per acre basis for your crops. Well, we'd like to see a little bit more. How are we going to value my crops? And we can include a formula, and we talk about that in our solar leasing guide. So the operations phase then begins once that project is constructed and we're now generating electricity or energy, I guess I should call it. This is going to be the period of highest payment. When everything's working and that solar energy is being collected and sent off site, that's where you're going to see the highest payment in that lease. Be aware though that sometimes that payment, that higher payment, is based only on the per usable acre. And they may calculate that as only the land that actually has solar panels on it, and any surrounding lands that might be bound up are not going to get that higher payment. So be aware of that. And there could be provisions, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, in a general term that we call a force majeure clause, that might lower that payment if for some reason we're not producing energy, even though the facility is up and running. For some reason, something happens that takes it down, you might revert to a lower payment if that downtime is over a certain period of days or weeks. And be aware that there could be extensions. You might agree to a 20-year term, but they might want you to also at the same time add an additional 5 or 10 or more years if they want you to. So you might be looking at a longer period than that initial operations phase period. After operation and the facility is going to go offline and we're going to terminate that leasing situation, we're entering into the cleanup phase that you'll often see in a lease. So when production ends, when there is no longer any energy leaving the site, there's language that'll say we're going to immediately go down to that lower payment of the cleanup phase. And sometimes you might see that they're willing to commit to a certain period that they'll clean up the site. Sometimes not. 1 year appears to be common, but I think probably more common is that they don't say at all how long that cleanup could take. And as I said, lower payment, and some leases don't even have a cleanup phase. I have found some that say nothing at all about cleanup. And so that's a little bit worrisome. What happens in that situation? So here are some examples of those different phases or periods of the lease and the rents that might be tied to them. And I was talking to Eric and I said, I still have these numbers from when we first started presenting on solar leases that we first heard going back as far as 2016. And you can see what those numbers were at that time. We know now that numbers have changed. And Andy suggested, what he's seeing. We hear things, we hear rumors. We don't know how definite those numbers are. As I said, many landowners are bound to confidentiality and they can't say what their numbers are. But I think it is safe to say, and I'm sure Eric would agree, that these numbers have gone up over the years and we are looking at higher numbers. But as we see these smaller projects taking a higher role in solar development, will we continue to see higher numbers, or will those smaller projects bring in different numbers? That's something that we're watching and waiting. But you can see here that payments are going to vary depending upon what period of that life cycle you're in for that project. And we've given you some ideas of numbers. Your numbers might look different. And that's just something that we can't confirm exactly what the number is that you might see if you're dealing with a solar lease. And note that there is that acceleration for inflation that Andy spoke about. And you can see here back in, I think this lease that we're looking at actually was from 2015. There was a 2.5% inflation adjustment factor. And Andy is not seeing that high of an adjustment factor now, according to what he just told us. So that's something that can change over time and within the context of that leasing situation. Okay. Oh, one other thing I want to point out here, and this kind of illustrates, here's the higher payment for land within the solar panel area, but anything outside of that is going to go down to a much, much lower payment. So be aware of that possibility. All right. So also within solar leases, we tend to find many different easements that you're agreeing to at the same time that you're signing that lease. So we're accustomed in the agricultural world to easements being separate legal documents that we enter into, but very common here that the easement is bundled in with the lease. And when you sign that lease, you're also agreeing to an easement. And so many different types that we see, and I'm going to touch on those. And the common questions that we have regarding all of these easements is, what is the location? Can we try to confirm? Do we need to confirm the location of that easement? How broad are we? How broad are the rights that we're granting within the terms of that easement? And is there an additional payment for that easement, or is it just part of these other payments that I've already discussed? So keep those questions in mind as we look at the different types of easements that we might see within the lease. First, not surprisingly, there's something called a solar easement. Well, what that does is binds you to granting that developer exclusive and unobstructed access to the sun on that site that they're leasing. So that at the same time would prevent you from doing anything that would interfere with access to the sun in that lease area. And you can see down here in this lease, some restrictions here saying trees and buildings and other improvements can't remain if they interfere with our access to the sun. And that's something that sometimes surprises our landowners. We also have an access easement that would give them access to that solar project area. So if it's on the back 40, for example, you might be granting them an easement to access that from the remaining parcel. So they need to get to that portion of the land, you grant them an easement that would allow them to go over and across your other property in order to access that land. And you can see the language here for ingress and egress from the solar facilities. And sometimes there's language that will say, we'll just use the current routes if you have a laneway, for instance, on your farm. Sometimes they'll want to put in their new, and you can see here that this provision gives the developer the discretion to improve or build new roads in order to implement that easement for access. You might see a construction easement within. This is not always in a lease, but what this does is says, well, we want the right to engage in our construction activities on other portions of your land and or on the solar project area itself. Often we will see provisions that would allow them to create a laydown yard, and sometimes landowners are surprised by that when suddenly there's a half-acre gravel parking lot put onto the land. That's their laydown yard. That's where they're going to bring in all of the equipment and hold it there as they then construct the facility. So be aware of those provisions that all relate to the construction process. Many times that construction easement will terminate upon the ending of that construction process. And we do want to address somewhere within the lease, if it's not in the easement for construction itself, we want to address returning that construction area to some new state, or restoring it to its previous state, which we are learning may be impossible. But you can see here the language in this lease says that they will restore the premises that's not occupied by the solar facilities that we do use for construction and other purposes. We will restore it to substantially the same condition that it was in prior to construction. Well, attorneys can argue all day about what substantially the same condition means. So we may need, as I'll mention later, some baseline data here to help us implement that provision of the lease. You'll often see a transmission easement. Of course, they'll need to take that energy that is generated on your land somewhere. So the transmission easement would allow them to place poles and towers and wires and whatever is needed, cabling, in order to transmit the energy produced on the land. And so here's an exclusive easement across the property for locating those kinds of things: poles, towers, wires, cables, underground, above ground, in order to collect and transmit that electrical energy. And you can see this one includes communications purposes as well. So it's not just transmitting energy, but transmitting communication bundled in with this transmission easement, and all of the infrastructure or foundations that might be necessary for that transmission need. There is often, I have found, an additional payment for a transmission easement because it often goes a little bit differently than the rest of the land that might be under some of these easements. So you can see here a payment provision, $2 per linear foot. And then there's some other where we might have a $4 or $3 per linear foot payment. But be aware that sometimes a transmission or access easement might have that additional type of payment associated with it. And then finally, we might have a nuisance easement that grants the developer a right to be a nuisance. So building this project is certainly going to have some nuisance impacts. We have equipment coming in and out. We have dust. We have noise. We have, the roads somewhat being used more heavily than they have been. So impacts on and off your land. Signing this agreement and with a nuisance easement within it says you're not going to try to come after us for those annoyances and inconveniences that you might endure as a result of our project, even both while we're constructing it and even afterwards. I mean, you can see here they talk about noise, reflective glare, other nuisances that you might think exist. You're forfeiting your right by signing this easement. And you might find that your developer, and I know that some landowners have asked their developer to enter into some kind of a nuisance agreement with neighbors with a payment, though, not waiving as you are under your lease, but a good neighbor payment to deal with some of these nuisance impacts. And having that type of agreement with neighbors might be helpful. Okay, I know we're running out of time. We did this yesterday, Eric, and here we are again. So I'm going to keep moving quickly here, but I want to plant some thoughts on property management and use issues that we sometimes don't see in a lease that we would like to see in the lease, if possible, to negotiate, add these provisions in. They're often lacking or non-existent, but we do need to address these within the lease, even if they are addressed within, for a large project, that application process that they must go through. As I said, we want to get as much as we can in the lease that we as landowners can enforce in the future. So construction standards have become a big issue, and we'd like to see more of those. I think some of those early leases that we reviewed said nothing about grading or soil removal, or they said something very broad. I think Eric found one that said, or maybe that was in the application itself, that we're just going to grade whatever is necessary to put our project in. We're finding landowners are now surprised by the extent of grading and soil removal that is occurring when the project is constructed. Can we address that within the lease? What about surface and subsurface drainage? I know we've had some issues with that too as construction commences. What can we get into that lease to try to protect those needs that the land and our surrounding land, whether it's ours or our landowners near us, our neighbors, might have in regards to that construction process? So there are construction standards I know that are under development right now, and we'll see some good language that we can now incorporate into leases that deal with that.
Yeah,
Eric, is there something you wanted to say there?
Yeah, I don't want to get us off target because I know we're running tight on time, but this to me kind of goes back to some of your initial slides that talks about kind of determining what your motivation is, talking with the family, and how much do you really want this project to happen, right? Because as Andy talked about, some things tend to be negotiable, some things maybe not so much. And so I think you have to ask yourself, like, if we're concerned about grading, as an example, because we have seen some examples where they have in their power siting board application suggested that they will grade anything within the project boundary. And we've seen others on the opposite side of that say outside of access roads, we will have less than 5% of the project area will be graded. And so there's different approaches to that. But I guess my point is, as a landowner, if they're not willing to negotiate on that, you have to ask yourself, are we comfortable moving forward if this entire site that we're leasing, if they strip the topsoil? Because that's, in a sense, the worst possible outcome, right? So you have to be prepared for that. So I think it's kind of an interesting debate that you could find a potential landowner in as they think about what has been happening as we've seen some of these projects go through construction. And again, there's two very different paths that we've seen developers take on that. And how do we react to that? So certainly interesting point that should be discussed, I guess, at this phase.
Mm-hmm. It is, and I think it's one that we didn't recognize early on, Eric, that it would be as much a concern as it has come to be today. And so I hope that we can work through some of these issues as these projects come online, but definitely some standards that we could try to include now in our leases moving forward. And there are other damages that can occur to fences, to other improvements on the land. How will those be dealt with? What about vegetation management and responsibility for noxious weeds? That's something that many landowners are nervous about, certainly those surrounding that project area. Can we address that within the lease provisions? And maintenance, we talked about access and transmission areas. We also want to tie some obligations to maintain those areas. And many ask about, what can I do in and around this project? Can I still have my hunting lease? Can we engage in other recreational activities, other kinds of land uses? Sometimes there are restrictions that would affect those other rights to use the property. And also there will be provisions common in many leases that address the possibility of environmental harm and delineating whether that harm is due to that solar project or whether it's something that may have existed prior to that solar project for which the landowner would be responsible. So that's another kind of property issue that we often want to see in a lease, that we address that. Here are some provisions. I told you we don't always find a lot in leases on these issues, but I did find this agreement here that the developer would pay for the actual cost of repairing any damage to the drain tile system. And that's where, as Andy mentioned, it would be helpful to make sure they know where your drain tile system is. So especially those mains, as Andy mentioned, but your laterals as well. You can see here a provision that they will agree to pay damages for crops, grass, fences, or other property or improvements that are outside the lease premises that occur during their construction and installation and operation. So sometimes those other areas are affected unintentionally, and so we can get some compensation there. And last, you see that hazardous substances clause that tries to delineate that we'll be responsible for solar project environmental harm or hazardous substances. But if it was something that isn't related to our solar project, then the landowner maintains that liability for that. Okay, so let's jump into taxes and just quickly understand that not all leases address these issues either. There, I think, are some assumptions that are made when it comes to taxing. But typically what I've seen is that real property taxes remain with the landowner, and there might be an increase in that in that amount because typically we're taking land out of CAUV, our differential tax assessment program in Ohio, that is taxed at its agricultural value and now taxing it at the value as this developed property. So what happens to that increase? Some developers just let that be the obligation of the landowner, assuming that the rental payment is intended to address that. Some will agree to cover that gap that might occur. And you can see here a provision that addresses only personal property taxes. And that's what we often see, that the personal property taxes are paid by the developer, which of course would be the taxes on that infrastructure that is placed on the land. So that's very common. Current agricultural use valuation, if the land is in CAUV and is going to be converted to a non-agricultural use, there's a little bit of confusion and uncertainty over when a recoupment fee is due. And that would be a 3-year look back on those CAUV savings. If land is taken out of ag, that's the obligation of the landowner to pay that 3-year recoupment penalty, basically, for taking it out. And so there's some language in the Ohio Revised Code that Eric and I have just looked at and thought, why is this here? It creates some confusion in saying if part of the parcel is taken out, then there won't be a recoupment penalty. Which suggests that if all of the parcel is taken out, then there is a recoupment penalty, but it's a bit gray. And I think that county auditors are interpreting that language a little bit differently, but be aware that there could be that 3-year recoupment period, and you may need to negotiate that and have the developer pay for that penalty. So different tax issues that can come up. But you see here one provision that says that any changes in real property taxes, this is what I was talking about up here, that are attributable to that project, this developer, the lessee, is willing to be responsible for those. So different provisions that we may or may not see within a lease on taxes. Okay, let's talk quickly about decommissioning and cleanup. We will talk more about this topic in our 5th webinar, but I want to highlight the importance of also including and addressing decommissioning or terminating that lease and cleaning up that property within the lease, as well as with the other new laws and regulations that we now have in place as a result of Senate Bill 52 that became effective in October of 2021. That new law applies to those large facilities over 50 megawatts, and it now requires a bond, a decommissioning plan, cleanup within 12 months, and restoration of the land to its pre-construction state. That's going to apply to those large facilities. Does not apply to these smaller ones that Andy was talking about. Even so, it's important, whether you're large or small, to have cleanup provisions within the lease, because that is your private personal enforcement mechanism or your future heirs mechanism for enforcing the cleanup. It's very critical to have that when we're talking about a smaller lease. So some of the considerations when we're talking about taking down that project and taking it off the land is, what is the time frame that we're going to allow for completion? How will that infrastructure be removed? How much of it will be removed? And once it's removed, what kind of restoration do we expect the developer to make? And how do we know 30 or 40 years from now what restoration even looks like? So we need some baseline data that would establish what the property was before this construction occurred. There might be some provisions that say, if we don't do it within this certain period, we're going to give you the right to clean it up as the landowner, and sometimes even will allow you to charge us for some of your cleanup costs, but some of those can be pretty tricky, and we want some kind of security or bond that would ensure that that cleanup will at least occur. It will be financed through the bond if the company doesn't actually do that. And you can see here some provisions regarding cleanup that we found in a lease that do address, an obligation by the company to remove them. But note here, they're only removing to a depth of 3 feet below grade. So anything that's more than 3 feet below the ground, they're not going to remove it. They're just going to go in and chop off those posts at 3 feet below, take it out. If the wiring, cabling, anything like that is beneath, is more than 3 feet, there's no obligation here in this lease for them to deal with that. So different provisions that we'll find here gives the owner the right to remove it if they don't. And there's a bond that's posted, but note that the bond isn't posted until 15 years into the operating term. And Ohio law now says, no, we need it. we need something a little bit sooner than that. We don't know who will be in charge of this facility in 15 years. Will they know about their obligation to post this bond? We'd like to see a bond posted at the outset. So some issues raised there for decommissioning and cleanup. Here's another provision that says that the company will remove the facilities within 1 year and will pay that different rent during that removal period. And so you can see those kinds of language, very common. But look at this sentence here, except as provided in the immediately preceding sentence, company is not obligated to restore the property. So be aware of this kind of language. And this again highlights the importance of having an attorney nitpicking through all this language and helping you understand those lease provisions. And I think that Andy did a nice job of touching on several of these general legal terms that we tend to find in solar leases and many other kinds of leases and contracts that we deal with in agriculture. You'll see that force majeure clause that says they aren't liable if something occurs as an act of God or an act of nature or something along those lines. And often there will be provisions that if that act of God or nature took that facility offline for more than 3 days or whatever it might be, then they can lower your rental payment until that production is resumed. So be aware of that. Indemnity, Andy touched on, and that is let's decide who's liable for what, who will stand in the shoes of that, that party that might be liable for someone else's harms. Those kinds of provisions Andy highlighted as being really important for negotiation. We could see some lender protection terms, and we touched on that too in Andy's portion of the program, where they're trying to protect their financiers and they're trying to protect that investment with the lease, as Andy said, not with the actual real property, but with the lease. And then we also might have some protections against the landowner going into foreclosure or having liens, that we want to ensure that their project is protected from those kinds of issues. An arbitration clause might be in a solar lease that requires using arbitration if there is a dispute. I personally don't like arbitration. Some of you may have heard me say that before. So I would prefer to see a mediation type clause, but be aware of that possibility. And of course, as we often see in a lease or a contract, there will be rights to assign that to other parties. That's very common. So let me close. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but let me close by reviewing some best solar leasing practices. Relying on your advisors, of course, is important. Knowing what that project is, what is the big picture for that project, for that developer, what process will they be going through, what does the future look like for this developer and project, and what is the possibility that it will ever come into fruition. That's something you need to be aware of and weigh heavily, and do some homework on those developers and get a sense. As Andy said, he sometimes asks for references from other landowners who've dealt with this developer. Get a sense of who you're dealing with, not just if they construct the project, but what's their financial stability, what's their credibility look like. And there are many ways to do that. Address conflict within your family and within your community. That's certainly a recommendation, I think, that can help this process. You might learn that there are some emotions and problems and conflicts that could arise from this that you simply don't want to deal with or don't want to create. And so that's something that I would encourage you to think about before going into a solar lease, and aligning that lease with your farming operation, with your estate plan, with your transition plan. How does it fit into the bigger picture of what you're doing as the landowner with your farm, with your estate? Those are important questions to address early. And then as we look at the lease, of course, you need to understand that lease, how it works, what its structure is, what those different periods are, and negotiate those lease terms using a knowledgeable attorney. If the project does come into being, then you know, there are different concerns that we have. So tracking it to see if it will come into being, keeping track of it if it's a larger scale project, harder to do if it's a small project, but trying to get an idea of where they are in that process and whether it really will come into place is certainly a practice that you can follow. And then finally, if it does occur, reviewing your lease and being ready and willing, or letting your heirs, those future landowners, know about those terms so that they can pick up that lease and enforce it if they need to. So with that, Eric, I know I'm over. I apologize, everyone, but thanks for staying with us. I will stay on and try to answer these questions that I see have accumulated. So those of you who need to leave, please do know that we have a recording that will be available if you want to come back to this. We have a ton of publications and videos and resources on this website that you're seeing here. And know that we are going to continue this discussion tomorrow with session 3, which is connecting to the electric grid. And Eric is going to explain this pretty complicated process of how that all happens. He'll give an overview of the electric utility system, regulatory jurisdiction, and those different procedures and timelines that are there, you know, in the background, always playing out. So that's what the session will be tomorrow. And next week, we'll do sessions 4 and 5 that get more to the projects themselves, how they're approved, and what happens when one does come into being and is constructed. Okay, Eric, what else would you like to chime in and say?
No, I think it's some great information, Peggy. We do have a few questions to work through if people want to hang around. I tried to hold those just in respect of time. I didn't want to get you off track, as I think a lot of these we've addressed or at least touched on. So maybe there's some clarity that people are looking for. But no, great information. I appreciate Andy's input and certainly your experience and knowledge on this topic as well. So appreciate that presentation. Do you want me to kind of walk us through some of these questions here?
Sure, since you've had a minute to look at them, we'll see what we can do with them.
Okay, so looks like one of the questions, I guess, kind of similar to right around the decommissioning talk that you had came in, was what happens if the company goes bankrupt?
Right. And there can be provisions in there that provide some protections, but you have protections in that you might arise to the level of being a secured party. But be aware that bankruptcy for this kind of a company would be a federal process subject to federal bankruptcy laws. And so you may need to be part of that process. But typically in bankruptcy, there would be that federal oversight that would address how parties like you would be paid. It could be that the project itself would be transferred to another party, sold or whatever it might be. And so the lease would run with that transfer and remain in place. Now, if the project goes down, we're in a slightly different issue, but you would be afforded many of those protections that are afforded to that kind of a protected party in a bankruptcy situation. But it's something to be aware of that could happen. If it's a good project and will continue to be online, I don't see it being a major problem because that lease would still be in effect.
Yeah, and that's also one of the reasons why I think it's important, and we'll touch on this, I think, a couple of times throughout the next few sessions. But the recent Senate Bill 52 legislation has requirements that the performance bonds are set in place for decommissioning and removal and restoration prior to construction, and that amount is based solely on the cost of that decommissioning, and not including any salvage values as revenue during that process. And it needs to be updated, so that decommissioning cost needs to be updated every 5 years. So, recent legislation is really putting some state law to kind of give some protections against that, I guess.
Yeah, that's a
But
good point.
it's really important, though, that landowners still protect themselves through this leasing process, because if your project is under 50 megawatts, that piece of legislation doesn't apply to your project, right? So there's still that importance to have that level of protection in your lease. So this is maybe a similar one. So what recourse does a landowner have at the time of decommissioning if the facility owner fails to meet all the requirements of a lease?
This was at the point of decommissioning, if we're
Yeah. So what?
so we're talking specifically about cleanup and removal.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so the recourse would really be dependent upon two things. One, if it's a large project and it's subject to the Senate Bill 52 decommissioning provisions, we'd have to look to that. But if it's not, then the recourse is going to be dependent upon your lease. And that's why I keep harping on how important it is to have those provisions in the lease. So you build that in. Here's what I can do if you don't do what you said you would do by the time that you said you would do it. Here are my rights to step forward. So we would look at that. But let's remember too, this is a contract. And so by entering into this contract, you do gain those enforcement rights. It may be that you have to take it to a court of law. Maybe that you do have to pursue payment from that person through those kinds of enforcement mechanisms. It's probably not going to be as simple as you would like it to be, that, oh, I'll just demand payment and they'll pay it. You may need to take legal action to enforce the provision of the provisions within the lease, but you do want those provisions in there that would say, and this is why that timeline is important. If you don't do it by X date, we now, you're in breach, and we can now enforce the provisions that say we're going to remove it and come after you for the cost of removal. As Eric said, not including the salvage value. We want to benefit from that salvage value, or we don't. You need to clarify those issues and have those contained within the lease so that you know what you or your heirs can do in the future. Eric, what would you like to add to that?
No,
Anything?
no, I think you
Cover it.
covered that one good. Here's
Yeah.
another one, maybe a little different topic. So, what are the legal rights for mineral owners compared to the surface owners for solar projects?
Yeah. Well, many of our leases in Ohio that are newer, that are the shale type leases, those are going to go in typically through the horizontal fracturing and may not need to use the surface. So that's kind of nice if you're in that situation. But generally, otherwise, if we're looking at a mineral lease that existed first, I would guess, and Ohio law would support, our court-made law would support this concept that the lease has a provision that says, with this lease, I also obtain the surface rights to access these minerals that I now lease. And so we do set up a clear conflict if the access is in that area where a project is planned. But the developer will do their due diligence and discover that, and will want that to be addressed. If they do good title research, they'll see that, oh, we could have a conflict here. So they may want you to negotiate with that mineral owner
And
and revise that so that we don't have that surface conflict. If it becomes a battle, we might have to take it to court over, whose rights are superior. And I would, I don't want to guess how a court might rule
and I
on
do
that.
know that just based on conversations with landowners that are working through this process, that I'm aware of a couple of examples where the utility scale developers have kind of done their due diligence prior to actually executing a lease agreement, and found those existing pieces. And so they, the landowner was kind of concerned, are they going to be able to do this with that? But unfortunately, I don't know how it was resolved, but I do know, as you mentioned, the solar developers are doing their homework on the front end as well to make sure that they can identify and avoid those conflicts, or resolve those conflicts ahead
Right.
of time.
And it's important to note, it might not just be a mineral lease, it might be reserved mineral rights that a prior owner held on to. In either situation, whether there is a lease or is not, we may need to terminate those rights, buy out the lease. The developer might require that, or
So
they
here's
don't
a
want to
question.
deal with that clouded title issue.
Here's a question that maybe, I guess, is kind of similar, and it may be a simple yes or no, but I do think like the recognition of this as an issue is kind of interesting and important to bring up. So would you recommend a solar only or wind only agreement?
Oh, I would. Yes. I don't think we want to lump those together and say they can do one or the other, because in our experience, Eric, there are much different impacts on the land, on the operation, um, even different, community views and impacts from one versus the other. So I think we would need
Right.
to address those different impacts and different needs depending upon the type of development that it is. So
And
I
in
would
most
not like to
cases, I feel
combine
like
them.
what we've seen is very, very, solar specific. It's very clear that that lease is written for solar. Uh, and it's been years, but I can remember one agreement that we looked at that kept referring to energy development. And but for the most part, it does seem like the agreements that we're seeing are very much, technology
One or the other.
specific.
Yeah.
But I guess the simple answer to that question, I would agree, would be yes. um, you would want it to be technology specific.
Yeah. Just one or the other. Definitely. I
Okay.
see a question here about, are you working with anyone at ODA or OEPA on BMPs for lease agreements? And the answer is not that we're working with them, but that we are aware that they are working on construction standards, dealing with drainage, those kinds of BMPs that we'd like to see for these, what turn out to be significant construction projects. And so we're hoping to see those come online soon, Eric, right?
Yep. Yep. That's I guess all we know at this point is, they're they're working through some of these BMPs are in draft format, and hopefully we'll have some additional clarity on a lot of this stuff moving forward. Okay. So let's look at where we want to go from here. So this is, I guess, one of the first ones. So we'll get to this. In regards to legal interest, would you recommend a title search be formed by the property owner, or would you solely rely on a title search performed by the developer?
Well, for many of those legal interests that I discussed, I think the landowner's already going to know what they are. Um, so do you need to go as far as a title research right off the bat? Maybe not. Maybe you can let some of those unknown interests that might come up, let the developer find those and tell you how they want to deal with those. But the ones I'm referring to are the ones you are already aware of dealing with in your operation. You know what farm programs, let's say you have some CREP land, if you have a deed of agricultural easement on some or all of your farm. If you've granted an easement for drainage to your neighbor. Talking about all those legal interests, or if you're leasing the land currently to a tenant operator, all of those things that you are dealing with now, you need to think about those because they stand um, to be affected by entering into a solar lease. And the other one, of course, would be your lender. You know what you have going on. on the land in regards to loans and mortgages, those kinds of things. So those are the ones that I think you need to get on the stick and take care of right away. Now, if there's some, you know, reserved mineral right from 100 years ago that could come up in the title search. If you're really worried about that, you can go ahead and do that. But I think it's the ones that don't even require you to do a title search that you definitely need to deal with right away, and decide if you want to deal with if you enter into a solar lease, because that could be a factor where it just, no, the penalties from, you know, taking this out of this program, some of them you can't take out. You can't do solar development on an agricultural easement. You know, so kind of getting a sense of what you can and cannot do in regards to those kinds of legal interests, I would encourage you to do right away. Let the title search maybe be somewhere on your list of things to do, but
Yep.
definitely doesn't need to be accomplished completely through a title search. Sorry, that
Great.
was a long and rambling answer, Eric.
No, that's good. Good. Um, okay, so let's talk about easements, I guess, or stick with, in some sense, easements. In regards to easements, specifically along a township or county-owned road that were obtained as transportation easements long ago, um, should the property owners, if the property owner still owns land along the roadway which it's been constructed, would you recommend a second easement be granted to the developer within the existing roadway easement? A lot going on there.
Oh, yeah, that's a bit of an odd question.
And honestly, I feel like that
I
is more of a question for the developer than it would be
It
the
is, it is, but I would say it's probably kind of a moot issue because
Mhm.
they typically don't allow that development to go up to that close to the road.
Right.
Um, whether you're in the OPSB process, and some of the local zoning regulations that I've seen, I don't think it would even be an issue where we might have that concern about an overlap. But I agree with you,
Oh.
Eric. That's something to let the developer deal with if they think the project will overlap into that easement.
So here's a question that maybe a little different angle here. So with lease rates around $1,000 per acre per year, why wouldn't there be a sale at the net present value? So
A sale.
I think they're talking about, I think the question is really kind of getting at why do the developers want to lease the land versus buy the land? And
Oh,
um, yeah, that's a question we get a lot. I think, I guess for number one, there are some developers in Ohio that are purchasing land versus leasing. So it's not as common, but that is something that's been done. Another thing, I guess, talking with some of the folks and the developers in the industry, land acquisition, at least the last time I'd looked, I should double check with the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure that nothing's changed. But at one point, land acquisition was not a qualified expense under the 30% investment tax credit program. So I assume that probably influences it some as well.
hmm.
Yeah, that's a question we get a
Well,
lot.
and think about the capital outlay, you know,
Right.
at the beginning when they don't even know for sure if the project will
Proceed. Right.
proceed. That's a large investment of time and money to make to purchase
And
something.
we'll look at some of those trends tomorrow as well in terms of,
Hmm.
projects in the queue and those that make it all the way through into operation.
Hmm.
Okay, so three more here. Let's see, I haven't read this one all the way through yet. Would you have any recommendations in regards to how property owners can deal with abandoned oil and gas wells within a development area?
So it's within the land. If it's within the land that the developer wants, again, I think we kind of look to the developer. Um, they know it's there. What are they going to expect um, you to do? What are they willing to do? And also, you know, you do have to be aware of Ohio law on those issues. So As far as recommendations, I think that's a discussion that needs to occur in the lease negotiation. That's my recommendation, that you deal with it there and decide how you're
Yeah.
going to, how you'll deal with that. And it may be that you want to, put that off until you know whether they're actually going to exercise the option. Then something would happen. I can't say that I've seen, nothing comes to mind, right? Do you think of anything, Eric? Any provisions you've seen on those abandoned wells in a lease?
Not that I've seen in the
Yeah,
lease. I don't know if
yeah,
the question's kind of getting at,
remediation of that. Yeah,
well, I wonder if it's kind of, if we find these by accident, right? We didn't know that they were
right.
there, and then as we get
So
into
that,
it, and
yeah,
and,
that could be
I know that, I don't know how much of that, like you mentioned, Ohio law, how much that would get into the how, ODNR and the Ohio Department of Natural Resource. I know they have the,
right,
orphan well program, and that type of, I assume would be called in as
right.
well. So, but yeah,
So yeah,
I
for
haven't
that
come
reason,
across
it
that.
would be, wise to do some due diligence now, if you think you might have an abandoned well, to check that out and get into that orphan wells program. I know there's a lot of demand for that, but that could be something that you could deal with now if you are thinking about leasing. But otherwise, I think it's something to discuss with the developer if you are aware of it.
Um, I would agree. So two more here. How do you obtain good information on the numerous companies reaching out? Yeah, I think it's,
Oh,
I think I'm kind
just
of
the
just
due
getting it.
diligence
Yeah, how
question.
do you do your due
Okay, I
diligence?
see it
And
here. Actually, in our solar leasing guide, we make some recommendations, and attorneys are good at this. This is something that we are trained to do, to investigate the background of a company. But there are many ways that even you can do it as a landowner. A lot of good resources that you can turn to, a lot of good searches you can do. So we have some recommendations in the solar leasing guide if you want to take a look at those. Oh, I believe they're in that chapter 2, initial considerations. We have a whole page of suggestions on how to kind of look into a developer.
okay. Um, last one. So if a stormwater pollution prevention plan issue and or subsurface drainage issue were to occur, who is liable in Ohio for damages to others? The property owner, the developer, or both?
So I would like it if the question was who might be liable, because then I could say, well, everybody is always subject to that. When we're looking at the landowner and the possessor of the property. But I think if it's clear that it was a result of the project, a good lease will address that. So we need to look at the lease, but we also need to look at law. And the law is more likely to go after uh, the party that actually caused that sedimentation. Is, I think that's the, yeah, sediment pollution.
Yeah.
Um, so they're more likely to go after that party. But I'm always nervous for landowners that are harboring those potential issues, because it's easy to try to bring the landowner into that as well. And that's where we need the lease to make sure that we have that indemnification, that the company will be responsible. So that kind of clause that I showed earlier would certainly help with that situation and say, you're going to step into this role of liability and I'm going to step out of it as a landowner, and you're assuming and you're promising to hold me harmless from any liability that you would incur. And that kind
Well,
of clause, as Andy said, he's hard at negotiating those for that very reason.
and I think that's a really good one to wrap up on. I think it really reinforces what I've heard you mention time and time again. That is, you really want to think through from a landowner's perspective, what is the worst possible outcome, and then ask yourself, and more importantly, ask your attorney, are we prepared for it? And so, Peggy, I just can't thank you enough for your insight on this, experience on this. A lot of really good information as evident by the question. So with that, I think we can go ahead and stop the recording and wrap up. And
All right.
again,
Thanks,
we look forward
everyone.
to seeing everyone tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock.